pray. Amen.
Amen. Acts chapter 6, verse 13. This man does not cease to speak blasphemous words against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say, this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs which Moses delivered to us. Chapter 7, verse 1. Then the high priest said, are these things so? Stephen is on trial. He has been dragged before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. This is both the legal and religious branch of the government. So he is under the highest court in the land and has now been given an opportunity to defend himself, quote unquote, against the charges that have been brought. What we have in chapter 7 is Stephen's response to that question, are the things that have been said against you true? And he will, of course, answer that. Acts chapter 7, we described last week, is the setup for the real change in the book of Acts. Up until this point, it has been relatively slow-moving, sedate. The church is growing in Jerusalem, but it's staying right there in Jerusalem. There's great strength that is being applied to the church. The number of disciples is multiplying and multiplying greatly, but it's all right there in Jerusalem. Well, it's about to spread like a dandelion stalk blown. The Christians are about to be distributed throughout the world, and that's going to have a big impact on the spreading of the gospel. Now, Stephen's response, beginning in verse 2, is 98% history of Israel. What he does is go back and talk about the Old Testament people and what happened. It is 100% laid at the feet of God. Stephen's defense, if we're going to give a summary of it, is God acted in history to bring about these events, and he continues to do so with Jesus. Now that's Stephen's conclusion, is that God also brought Jesus into this picture, and the temple is not a dwelling place for God, but rather God is a spirit, and that will come out in other discussions. His final statement that makes them so angry they can't see straight is when he tells them the Jewish people have always rebelled against God, and you are doing the same thing. And then they blow their stack and drag him outside and kill him. All right. So, chapter 7, verse 2. And he said, brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, get out of your country and from your relatives, and come to a land that I will show you. If we were to take the history of all of the events that Stephen describes and go back and explore them, we would be looking at, all of the Old Testament. So it's really not possible to do that. There is a connection that Stephen is going to do as he gives a very rapid thumbnail sketch of the major events and players through the Old Testament. Now, no, it's not complete, it's not full, but it gives the big movements, beginning with Abraham. When we look at the Old Testament, up until the call of Abraham, the Old Testament is relatively undirected. And I say that we have Adam and Eve and the table of nations and the discussion that takes place regarding them, Noah and the destruction that God brings on the world because of their constant immorality, and then nothing until we come to Abraham in chapter 12. God's oversight of the world looks to be a watch and see kind of action. Well, in Genesis 12, that changes because God makes contact with Abraham. Abraham did not choose God, God chose Abraham. While he was still in the old country, down in Ur of the Chaldeans. Those of you who are familiar with history probably remember we talk about the Fertile Crescent, and that begins down here in Sumer, Babylon, Assyria. Then we cross over here, we get into the what we'll later call Israel, and for lack of better discussion, we'll leave that there. So this describes what is sometimes called the Fertile Crescent, and that is the places where humanity lived. Out here is desert, so you didn't cross going that way. So if you were traveling to this area, you went along that route right there. And Sumer is going to be the ancient, one of the most ancient historical sites of biblical, of world record. Ur, the city of Ur, where Abraham lived for a while, has many ancient records that date us back to 4,000 BC or so. So long time before we're going back to. So Abraham being called is a big deal. While he was in Mesopotamia, what do we? That's the Fertile Crescent. That's what our word is for the Fertile Crescent. Okay. And told him, "Get out of your country, from your relatives, come to a land I will show you." God made an invitation for Israel, or for Abraham, to come. What were the promises that God was going to make regarding this? God said, "I will give you land, I will give you law, and I will give you legacy. You will be a great nation. I will provide for you and give you guidance for how you should live, and you will possess this land through your children." Okay? How much of it would Abraham possess? While Abraham was alive, how much land in the land of Canaan would Abraham own?
A grave. Yeah, it's better yet.
The cave of Machpelah. He's going to own the burial site of Sarah, where when she dies, Abraham goes to the people who own the land and say, "I need a place to bury my loved ones that I own." And they said, "The land is worth so much. What's that between us and you?" And Abraham pays it out, and that's how Abraham came to own the land. Then he went out of the Chaldeans, the land of the Chaldeans. Chaldeans, also known as the Sumerians, Ur of the Chaldeans. He went out of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he moved him to this land in which you now dwell. So we've got history here taking place. Abraham lived in Ur, called him to Haran, which is going to be up here, and he will live there until Terah dies, his father, Abraham's father, and he will live there in Haran until he dies, and then he will come over to what we will refer to as the land of Canaan, or the land of Israel now, and dwell in that land. So Stephen is talking about their history, in which you now dwell. Verse 5. "And God gave him no inheritance in it, not even enough to set his foot. But even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give him for a possession and to his descendants after him." So God says, "I'm going to give you this land through your family," but Abraham had no family. The promise was made, but it's going to be some time before it's fulfilled. The writer of Hebrews in chapter 11 talks about the concept of God making these promises to Abraham. That Abraham was promised these things, but they died in faith, not having received the promises. They were not fulfilled in Abraham's time. The promises were for afterwards, and we know a good bit of that history. Verse 6. But God spoke in this way, that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land, and that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them 400 years. And the nation to whom they will be in bondage I will judge, said God, and after that they shall come out and serve me in this place. Now, we're talking about, as Stephen is describing this, really the book of Genesis, chapter 12, 13, 14, 15, etc., in the wandering of Abraham. And so it's taking us back and covering that period of history. And of course, they knew that very well. God told Abraham when he promised him the land, I'm going to give them this land, or give your descendants this land, but I'm not ready yet to kick out the inhabitants. God's statement to Abraham is that the sin or the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. The Canaanite evil world has not gotten to the place where God is ready to throw them out yet. So, two things are going on. One, let's put in this time frame Israel. Okay, we've got Amorites, Canaanites, okay, you can't read that either. Sorry about that. Amorites, Canaanites are there, but they're not going to come here directly. They're going to have 400 years more to live in that land. Instead, where will the children of Israel be carried? Down here into Egypt, where what will happen to the children of Israel? They will grow into a mighty nation. They are in a protected place. They're going to have lots of children. And when they come out of Egypt, they will be ready to take on the land of Canaan and conquer it. But how do you take Abraham with no descendants and allow him to conquer the land of the Canaanites? Well, he can't yet. So it hadn't happened yet, but the time is coming. There's a statement made in the book of Galatians chapter 4 where Paul, describing Jesus, says, in the fullness of time, God brought forth his son, born under the law, born of a woman, in the fullness of time. What does that mean? God had planned these things, and all of the other things had to be in place before it took place. Jesus didn't come 200 BC. Why? The world wasn't ready for him yet. Why did he come when he came? Well, there are a lot of interesting conversations that happen regarding that. One of them being the Roman peace, Pax Romana, and what that did to the world. It allowed a settled period of time where the people of Israel were not at war, when there was a relative stability in the world and in the world region, where other times there had been great turmoil. But all of that was arranged by God. The plan was, and God had a plan, this is what's going to happen. The nation to whom they will be in bondage I will judge. They will come out after me. What would God do to the Egyptians? Well, first of all, he would pour out plagues against all the Egyptian gods. And each one of the plagues countered one of the gods that the Egyptians worshipped. And then, when the children of Israel left, they took out what else? All of their livestock and all of their gold, money. God said, the scriptures tell us that God made the children of Israel favorable in the eyes of the Egyptians, and the Egyptians gave them their wealth to leave the country. Just go. Get out of here. Go away from us. And the text says, in that way God plundered Egypt. Then the Egyptian army, after the children of Israel leave and begin to make their progress to the Red Sea, tries to follow them. And what does God do to the military force of the Egyptians? Destroys them in the Red Sea. So God conquers Egypt using Israel, and Israel never pulls an arrow, throws a stone, pulls a sword. God conquered Egypt, took their wealth, took their power. And so when Israel goes into the land of Canaan, they don't have anybody chasing them down. God has taken care of that. So God has provided for this. God judged them. Verse 8, then he gave them the covenant of circumcision, and so Abraham begot Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day, and Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs. The concept of circumcision is an interesting conversation. Why? Wow, that's a good question. I mean, we know why God said that this was the covenant mark between him and his people, but why? Why this? Well, that's another one of those real interesting questions that we're not going to be able to answer entirely. That was what God did, and it was well known and was understood clearly that this was the mark of being God's people, the Jew. I think it's a little unfair that it was only on males. I think there should have been some equal thing, for females in order to really bring about equality here. But I've never heard anybody complain about that. With all of the conversations I've heard about, women making observations about feminism and inequality, I have never heard a woman say, we really got ripped off. That there's no body part cut off of women.
Tim, speaking from, not that I'm a lady, but give the choice between circumcision and childbirth. I think I'd take circumcision.
Yeah, well, I've had kidney stones, and I've heard from those who had both. All right, so now we've got circumcision. All right, so this is going to be, there are going to be several things that the Jews really hold on to. This is one of them. Circumcision and Abraham. And that idea there, that they are tied back, this is the direct connection to God. This is proof of God owns us, we belong to God, we have this permanent relationship. The reason why I'm bringing up the concept of circumcision here is Stephen is going to do it again at his conclusion. And he is going to insult them in what would have been one of the most insulting ways you could treat a Jew, to call him uncircumcised. But anyway, we'll get there.
Hang on.
Yes.
8th day, it says it circumcised on the 8th day. Is that some kind of significance there?
Yes.
What is it? What does that mean?
That was the covenant requirement. 8 days after birth.
You know why?
God said so.
Oh, okay. That's good enough for me.
If I just interject a little bit.
Now, I've read some stuff about that there's that this is in children, that there's a less of a blood problem and a bleeding problem, and there are some other things that go along with that. But God chose, God made the date, not us. Yeah, Wayne?
Well, it just basically was that what I was going to say is because I read a book. It's called None of These Diseases.
Yes.
It's written by a medical doctor. It's a fascinating book, and he was explaining what Tim just mentioned there about circumcision, and it has a medical benefit behind it. It helps with purification and things of that nature, in the lineage. So I just thought it was very interesting that was the reason that God incorporated that, and knowing the medical benefits of it.
This was not a common practice among the nations. This was unique to the Jews. Okay, circumcised on the 8th day, and that's going to become what is done under the law. And Isaac begot Jacob. Okay, first of all, we're going to have Isaac. Abraham's going to have a son eventually. It's going to take a while, but eventually Abraham is going to have, I'll put him over here. He's going to give birth to Isaac. Isaac is going to give birth to Jacob. Jacob's name is going to be changed by God to Israel. If you're wondering where that name comes from, that's God's name for Jacob. And then he will have children. And the children who will become the tribes of Israel the 12 tribes. All of these are the sons of Jacob, also known as the children of Israel. So we have a nation that is going to take on the name Children of Israel. And this is where they get that name, right here. Okay, so Jacob's going to have his kids. Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob is the one through whom the promise is going to be fulfilled. And then we have all of the children. And in Genesis chapter, the last portion of Genesis, God moves Joseph down into Egypt, and then all of the family down into Egypt, and there they are given a place where they dwell, and God provides for them safely. You want to talk about providence. One of the most incredible images of providence is God's relationship with Joseph. How could God take a kid that's thrown into a pit and sold as a slave and bring him up to be the second highest man in Egypt? That's what God did with Joseph. I sometimes describe that the path to the throne was through the prison. Why did Joseph get thrown in prison? Why did God allow him to be so badly treated by Potiphar and Potiphar's wicked wife? Because the path to the throne was through the prison. God's way of bringing Joseph to bear the throne in Egypt was through that means. So that's God's hand unfolding here, the imagery of God. All right.
Was Joseph
Sir?
in the group that left Egypt?
Was
Moses,
Joseph in the group that left Egypt?
Was Moses, or was he already with his children? His body was carried, but he was dead several hundred years. Yeah. Joseph declared, "Don't leave me down here." Abraham took his father.
Yes.
So they
Yeah.
carried a lot of
Jacob was buried in Israel at his death. Joseph was embalmed according to the rites of the Egyptians and was left in Egypt. But his instruction to his people was, when you leave here, don't leave me down here. Take me out. So Joseph's bones were carried out of Egypt. Okay? I assume all of the other patriarchal originals died in the land of Egypt and were buried there. But we don't have record of any of that, so who knows? But Joseph did not. Verse 9. The patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him. There's our statement. God was with Joseph. God was with Joseph when he was hated by his brothers? Yes. God was with Joseph when he was sold as a slave into Egypt? Yes. God was with Joseph when he was falsely accused of being a rapist? Yes. God was with Joseph when he was in prison and was left for 2 years after he was forgotten? Yes. God was with Joseph. Yeah. So the fact that bad things happened to him along the way does not mean God was not with him. He was providing for him all the way, which makes some real interesting conversations for today when we ask ourselves, perhaps from time to time, why are these things happening to me? Do not assume that God brings all blessings to bear through good things. Many of our blessings come through difficulties and sometimes even tragedies.
I think that's the most beautiful thing when you read the story of Joseph, that it is repeatedly says exactly that, and God was with him.
God was with him. In fact, Joseph, in his last statements to his brothers, said, "You intended to harm me. God used these things for good." That's a great lesson right there. All right. Delivered him out of all of his troubles and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Now a famine and great trouble came over the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first, and the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to to the Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all his relatives to him, 75 people. So Jacob went down to Egypt, and he died, and our fathers, and they carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. Why doesn't he describe all the rest? I don't know. Why does Stephen pick out these particular items to highlight in his speech to the Sanhedrin? I don't know. But this is how Stephen described it. So we're talking about Genesis here and the involvement there. Now the book of Exodus opens up with verse 17. When the time of promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt till another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so that they might not live. At this time Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Pause there. When we start looking at the history of Israel, and we go back to Moses and the patriarchs, there is a great deal of information there that it's being summarized here in some very short sentences. All of Genesis covers the bringing of Joseph down into Egypt and how that God allowed him to grow up into a powerful force. Did God bring about the famine? The 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine that were in Egypt and throughout the world? Did God do that? Why did God do that? What was the result of God bringing about famine throughout the world? The force that God used to reunite Joseph and his father was a famine. If it hadn't been for the famine, Jacob and his family would not have gone to Egypt. They didn't know where Joseph was. They thought Joseph was out of mind, out dead, perhaps. And when they find out who Joseph is, and that's a wonderful part of the last bit of Genesis chapter, of the book of Genesis, 47, 48, 49 leads us through that story of Joseph rising up and the connection he has with the brothers. And you remember the story of Benjamin and how that all unfolded, and really interesting history there. Stephen says this was all for a purpose. God was working to bring these things about. Now, that's the overarching theme of all of Stephen's defense. God did all of this. These weren't just the random actions of mankind. God was doing this. God was pulling the strings, manipulating the world situation. He was actively involved in the world to bring these things about. Now, that brings up some real interesting questions for future things, but we'll go along here for now. All right, so what would have happened if there had not been a Pharaoh that made it hard on the children of Israel?
They would have been content to stay.
They never wanted to leave.
They wouldn't have left. What made it such that the children of Israel wanted to leave Egypt? Their burdens. Actually, did they really want to leave? No, they didn't. Even under their burdens, Moses had to drag them out of the land. But that was something that made their life very hard, and would be something that was described throughout Scripture as you brought them out of bondage. So they're brought out of bondage because of the successful growth rate of the children of Israel. The Egyptians are afraid of the Hebrews. And so they command them to start killing off the baby boys. And to what degree that was successful, I do not know. But did any Hebrew children die during this period of time? we would assume that the answer to that is yes. But Moses is not one of them. So Moses is described as having been kept for a while and then put in the basket, and you know the story, how the Pharaoh's daughter took him, raised him as her own. Verse 22, and Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. So God took a slave, Joseph, moved him up into the hierarchy of top of the land, the Pharaoh. Now God takes Moses, a cast out baby of the children of Israel, and does what with him? Moves him into the house of Pharaoh. Makes him the daughter, the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So now he is going to be raised in Pharaoh's house, instructed in the ways of Egypt. He is going to become an Egyptian by education, but he's still a Hebrew by nationality. God's hand, do you see God's hand working there? God's hand, and that's what Stephen is bringing about. God did these things. When he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. Seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand. But they did not understand. And the next day when he appeared to two of them as they were fighting and tried to reconcile them, saying, Men, you are brethren, why do you wrong one another? But he who did his neighbor wrong pushed him away, saying, Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday? Then at this saying, Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. Moses, attempting to help some of the Hebrew brethren who were struggling with an Egyptian taskmaster, killed the Egyptian, buried him in the sand, assuming his deed would be covered up, that they wouldn't turn him in because he helped them. But the word spread. This guy Moses killed an Egyptian. Well, Moses knows when that gets out, he's in big trouble. So he's going to flee, go to Midian. There he will meet God at a burning bush. And you know what happens from that. All right, let's keep going in our history. Verse 30. When 40 years had passed, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight, and as he drew near to observe, the voice of the Lord came to him. Pause there for just a moment. What age is Moses at this point?
80.
80? 80? Yeah, he's 40 years old when he did his thing in Egypt. He spent 40 years in Midian in the wilderness, and now God is going to bring him this sign. Most of us don't think about taking on a task like that at the age of 80. Moses began his leadership of Israel at 80. I ran across a statement made by one of my professors who I enjoyed very much through the years. His name was William Woodson. Some of y'all know Brother Woodson. He spoke here a number of times at my urging, and others. Brother Woodson wrote or said in a class at some point, and I wrote it down, that a man should retire as close to the age of 20 as possible. I'm sure he said that after his retirement. But anyway, when Moses should have been thinking about retirement at age 80, God calls him to begin a new phase of his life. 80 years old. You wonder why Moses was so reluctant to take on? When God says, I want you to go lead the children of Israel, Moses says, who am I? I'm an old guy. That's not one of the ones that comes up. He never brings up his age per se, but that's what he was. All right. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Verse 32 is important, and that statement is going to be used by Jesus to prove what?
Oh, that God is not the God of the dead, but the living.
Pre-circumcision.
Jesus quotes this verse and says, when he's arguing regarding the resurrection, God said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jesus makes an argument to the Jews based on the verb tense of that word right there. He says, God did not say, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, indicating that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob still live. Jesus said, God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Now here's Stephen using that same verse. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses trembled and dared not look. Then the Lord said to him, take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their groaning and have come down to deliver them. And now, come, I will send you to Egypt. This Moses, whom they rejected, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge, is the one God sent to be a ruler and a judge by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He brought them out after he had shown wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. This is that Moses who said to the children of Israel, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren, him you shall hear. All right, we've had conversation regarding Moses, and so Moses is going to be the hand-picked deliverer of God. The word judge is deliverer. Deliverer is judge. It does not mean one who sits on in a bench determining the outcome of a trial. It means one who delivers. Yes, sir.
I noticed that we kind of skipped from 14 straight into 7. I was curious about, as the council is taking on this history lesson here before it even starts. They looked on Stephen's face as the face of an angel. Was there some sort of special attention or light put on him, or what does that mean?
Good question. What do angels look like? Sometimes angels were indistinguishable from anybody else. They just looked like people. Other times angels stood out as being angelic
So he was
in some way.
transformed in some way before they killed him? These people are pretty bold.
Yes, they are. The men who were at the tomb of Jesus were bright. They glowed. There was a brightness to them. That's not always the case. That was not 5 minutes. Somebody talked to our bell ringer.
Actually 3 minutes.
That was like 90 seconds. What was Stephen's face looking like an angel? Good question. I wish I could answer it. I've never met one, so when I do, I'll let you know.
It's worked into some figure of speech.
No, it's not really going to become a part. Although the concept of angels was something that they held on to, and Stephen's going to use it 2 more times. The angel chose Moses to do this, and you received the law by angels. Stephen is going to describe. Thank you for your time and attention. Next week, Lord willing, we'll